Okay, welcome to this Medea Talk. My name is Bo Reimann, I'm director of Medea. So just a short introduction to Amanda before we start. Amanda is PhD and associate professor, docent in media and communication studies. You could say founder of Existential Media Studies, I think is the way to frame it here. She was a Wallenberg Academy Fellow starting in 2013 for 5 years. And at that time was then the director of the research program Existential Terrains, Memory and Meaning in Cultural Connectivity. And you can say that was the first media studies project ever to research the more existential dimensions of digitalization. And she created the international DigMex network, Digital Media and Existential Issues and Challenges, which now has almost 200 members across the world. And wrote, of course, a number of articles during that period. The book she edited for Routledge, which is called Digital Existence, Ontology, Ethics and Transcendence in Digital Culture. There's also a forthcoming book by Amanda herself on that part of the project. She may come back to that. She used to be based at Stockholm University, had a year at business school at King's College in London during the period, but is now based in Uppsala, and where at Uppsala, she is director of the really new Uppsala Informatics and Media Hub for Digital Existence. Basically continuing, I would say, addressing questions dealing with what it means to be human in an increasingly digital age. And what was really wonderful, just a couple of weeks ago, she got a 5-year grant from the Marcus Wallenberg Foundation for a completely new project, BioMe, Existential Challenges and Ethical Imperatives of Biometric AI in Everyday Life Worlds, which is going to be a really nice continuation of what we've been doing. Just want to finish with a quote from an article that I really recommend, which is called Existential Media, which was in New Media Society in 2017, where she writes, "It is time for media studies to attune to the big and basic questions in life, and to sound out and critically interrogate the lived and often complexly ambiguous experiences of our digitally enforced life world." And I think that's where I leave it to you.
Thank you, Bo, for this gracious invitation and this introduction. I'm so pleased to see so many here, and despite the fact that I had to cancel due to illness a couple of weeks ago. I should just get started. I have a lot to convey today. I want to die. Have you ever received a text message with this content? If you have, you will know that this is a moment of shortfall. At a loss for words, blueprints for action, and even a moral compass to follow, the message finds us clueless, floundering in an utter sense of urgency. No doubt, many will question whether it's serious or fake. Perhaps it's an automated machine product rather than the words of a human agent, a friend. But most of us will give it the benefit of a doubt. And in this limit situation of sheer crisis, uncertainty, apprehension, breakdown, and potential crash, to communicate seems both dangerous, risky, and maybe even futile. Should I respond? If so, how? We are thrown into an existential moment of ethical interpellation. Spotlighted singularly, we are confronted to act as existing beings, to, as Kierkegaard said, become singular or subjective. But what to do? The mundane is here traversed by the extraordinary, the routine interrupted by a catastrophic prospect and a calling to engage, to take action. But how? For media materialists, such as Yonder and Peters, stressing that, quote, "the apparatus is the basis, not the corruption of the world," end of quote. The key point is that the human condition is in fact conditioned by our technologies and media of communication, artifacts and design. Hence, also by the ways in which we speak. This implies the inevitability of instrumentally molding and remolding our existence via media and design. And yet, the question remains in this moment, what should we do? Despite not knowing what is right, wrong, expected of me, the only option then seems to be to try with available means to answer the message. And yet we may do so reluctantly. For existential media studies, issues with what the format affords us and when it is thoroughly lacking, classic critical issues in media theory amount to even more profound questions about the limits of our communicative techniques as well as of our ability or even will to communicate in contexts of utmost gravity. These questions are painfully acute also in relation to a world of increasingly autonomous and anticipatory systems. What of human responsibility and human capacity both to be, to make sense and to act and respond meaningfully and ethically in a world of all-pervasive automation? With artificial intelligence on the human horizon, the plot thickens even more. So this lecture, while aiming to elucidate the topic for today, existential media studies, will linger in these shadows of the known and knowable, and on the verges of failure, confusion, curtailment. It thus carefully situates the approach in the footsteps of Karl Jasper's philosophy, which lives on the limits. Jaspers understands human life as a limit situation, an existential given common to all humans. And by attending to the general limit situations, that is the time and historical context and situation we are born into, as well as the specific limit situations of life, such as loss, crisis, conflict, birth. That is the time when our vulnerability is principally felt and our security is shaken. We may learn something crucial about the possibilities and limits of digital communication itself, perhaps. So Jaspers fully recognizes both limits and uncertainty and how they are given exemplary form in speech. Speech, for example, texting, is a risk since it's fated to fail when the stakes are highest. In other words, for Jaspers, the most important things human beings can say to one another or share cannot quite be said. Communication thus conceived is more than the result of limits. It will inevitably in itself also produce new interruptions, new failures. Yet, precisely here in this fluency is the starting point for another form of communication, according to Jaspers. So I will read this quote. The sense of shortcoming in communication is thus an origin of the breakthrough to existence and of a philosophizing that tends to elucidate the breakthrough. As all philosophizing starts with wonder, and as mundane knowledge starts with doubt, the elucidation of existence starts with the experience of shortcoming in communication. By consequence, for the existentialist, the arrival of the text message and our failure to know how to respond also constitutes a moment when we are called to enter into what Jaspers calls existential communication, and when we are compelled to act in order to become ourselves, which requires our whole being. Instead, or now I will quote Jaspers again, instead of its actions being governed by objective rules derived from the entirety, the boundary situation of being definite calls upon existence to decide its destiny. Or as Sam Mickey puts this existentialist either or, where do you want to be? Do you want to be in a state of narcosis, deluded and passionless, anesthetized by formulas and certainties? Or would you rather be in a state of emergency, vulnerable to the extreme urgency of passion, exposed to the unpredictable exigencies of the world? So it should be noted from the outset that existential media studies is an exercise in this vein, and in what I see as the main mission of the humanities. It is empirically grounded in the existential terrains of connectivity, and I will return to that. But it also provides perspective on being human. In our case, being human in and with digital media. So this is a deeply philosophically motivated project, challenging the foregoing of our shared existential vulnerability in media theory. Here it also challenges a particular masculinist ideal of the detached social scientist that still prevails in some quarters of media studies, and ever more so today, boosted by dataism itself. So in this lecture I will explain how the project that I headed returned to classic debates and concepts within the tradition of existential philosophy while upgrading them to contemporary stakes of digital media culture and to newer tides of theorization. And entering also into conversation with other strands of thought in the new materialism and elemental media philosophy and co-existentialism. On this route, I will also be in search for and ultimately cast the coexister for this role in the passionate drama of life, of digital existence, and of media studies. So in the final part of the lecture, I will say a few words about the new project that Bosse mentioned on biometrics that I'm setting out to head over the coming 5 years within the Wallenberg AI and Autonomous Systems Software Program Humanities and Society. There we have it. Okay, so what is existential media studies? So this approach to digital media has been developed largely within this project, which was funded by the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation and the Marcus and Amalia Wallenberg Foundation within the Wallenberg Academy Fellows Program. And also within the research network DigMex, that some of you actually are members of. So if anyone's interested in joining the network, it's an open network, and anyone interested is welcome. And I will also tell you more about our activities later. In this project, we placed a particular, but not exclusive focus on death online. And this both enabled and required a reconceptualization of our culture of connectivity as an existential and ambivalent terrain. So first we set out to explore and gain detailed knowledge about how fundamental existential issues are pursued when people's lives and memories are increasingly shaped in by and through digital media forms. And secondly, we set out to probe those existential issues and challenges we are facing due to digitalization. Our work, or I say this is the network and 2 of our conferences, and our one key word throughout the entire project was vulnerability, which I will return to. Our work drew inspiration from existential philosophy, and we have been listening to voices from the grave and mobilizing some of their key concepts, in particular the limit situation, Heidegger's thrownness, Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity, being there, being in and with the world, and others. While also, as I already said, trying to upgrade them to our contemporary age. That is, how can these concepts mean anything or mobilize anything for us today in our contemporary situation? And what new existential concepts would we need in order to address our digital existence? So what is the existential? I think one difficulty is, of course, that the existential means so many things to so many people. There are assumptions about hyper-individualism or atheism in Sartre, and some say there's something suspiciously Christian about Kierkegaard, yeah. And some praise and deplore these aspects, of course. Others think of Heidegger's critical view of technology as an inframing, that's the existential approach, or his positive and nostalgic affirming of or affirmation of crafts that are ready to hand, and thus of his vile politics, right? So specialists, and this makes it even more complicated, specialists agree that there is not one agreed upon definition. Existentialism is about refusing to confine existence to an ism and system. I think of existential philosophy as a universe with galaxies, or clusters of ideas held together by placing human lived experience centrally, a refusal to succumb to systems and reductionist thinking, a recognition that being human is a project and an instrumental and moral task in which communication is key, and a focus on ambivalence. Okay? But in my own mapping of the field, I identified two main emphases in the philosophy of phenomenology and of existence. I'm not suggesting that these are completely separate. In fact, I would stress that in individual thinkers, they are not. Nor am I saying that they should be. Simply for the purpose of pedagogy, I think it's worth encircling our aims and this emergent field of existential media studies, if we start by distinguishing them in order to explain then how we are drawing on both of them. So the first emphasis is the moral, okay, which is a focus mostly from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche on individuality, passion, fervent will and choice, authenticity, but also a focus on ambiguity, ethics. And the second emphasis is the material. So you have a primary focus on ontology, thingness, materiality, practice, tools, technologies, equipment, embodiment, and this sense of instrumentality. But both these emphases also stress, if we scrutinize them, important facets of what we have been exploring in our project, which is intersubjectivity, relationality, existential communication, transcendence, and care. Yeah. This is one way of trying to explain what this is about. Another important dimension of this is that existential media studies embraces the role within the tradition, the role of tensions and irreducibilities and entanglements. This is what Simone de Beauvoir called the ethics of ambiguity, which refers to the ability to harbor these irreducibilities and paradoxes. The first would be the moral material cluster then. And this corresponds to how existentialists stress the irreducible tension in existence between subject and object, between freedom and facticity. But then we have also, again, with a primary bow to Jasper's philosophy, this sense of limits as being both and something that can open something, and openings as always containing a limit. You see? So here, Jasper sees a fecundity in vulnerability. He sees communication as failure, but as possibility. You know, that type of irreducible tension. And another tension then has to do with the singular and the plural. And here, the primary source of inspiration is Jean-Luc Nancy's work, or his co-existentialist work, which articulate a sense of withness. We are singular beings that are always plural. So again, it's not either the individual or the society. We are singular, plural. Okay? And then, of course, existence and existence, which means existence is our mundane going about our world. Existence is when we realize our potential and become, as Kierkegaard says, subjective. Another such tension has to do with the fact that existential philosophers both see the world as given and as conditioned at the same time. Vulnerability, which I will return to, is both ontologically given to all and unevenly distributed socially, of course. So, finally, an existential approach to digital media then refers to digital media as mundane tools for navigating in and crafting the life world, and they have a role in the quest for meaning or struggle with non-meaning. But our media are also existential due to their importance in relation to extraordinary events that I will return to today, transformative or traumatic events that are life-defining. Media then are momentous. So in this book that Bosse also mentioned, I chose 3 entryways into the existential terrain. So the first is that digital media are existential media in an ontological sense. And this relates to the fact that we have a saturation of digital media in our life world, in wearables, networks, tools for navigation and communication in everyday life, and also a sort of co-constitution of media and the life world. And even more profoundly, these technologies allow, as John Durham Peter says, for life to thrive. They ground us in being, and they may potentially elevate, confine, or lessen the potential of that being. Or to put it differently, an enabling aspect of media may also contain new vulnerabilities at the same time. And that it also relates to the second dimension. Digital media are existential in the anthropological sense. They offer places where people may explore classic existential issues in relation to loss, trauma, and health issues. And they enable practices of meaning-making, community, rituals, coping, cohesion, and experiences of transcendence. But they also entail experiences of loss of meaning, of disorientation, ostracism, trolling, hurt, loneliness, and enhanced exposure. And in these look as if they are compartments. That's not the case. They're all entangled, but for the purpose of clarity here. And I've divided them like this. And the third transcendent or spiritual sense, in this book I included this dimension in its own right, and here placed a particular focus on the limit situation of death in the third section, but also on post-human understandings of both the internet and the human. So transcendence in a broad way of conceiving of it. So existential media studies draws on these resources in existential philosophy, yet, as I said, upgrades them. It is also a kind of new humanism, isn't it? After post-humanism, maybe. Here I will pause and note that indeed calls for a new humanism seem to be continually strewn across modern life, especially during peaks of techno-existential development or social upheaval and great uncertainty. And it seems equally true that existential philosophy has qualities that makes it discoverable and useful for each new generation. The impetus for me, however, to pursue this approach has also been a discovery closer to home. There is, I submit, with important exceptions, an existential deficit in media studies. We go back 10 years. Web 2.0 was here, and digital and often social media quickly became part of our entire life world, embedded, embodied, emplaced, and every day. They achieved a new form of centrality. They became even more important, spanning everything between life and death. In their mundane every-awareness or always there-ness, as Sherry Turker here says, they wired us into existence. So social media and the rapid digitalization of the human life world implied, among many things, that death and dying became even more entangled with digital life. So I was struck then to notice how this actually fell under the radar of media studies to a large degree, while being attended to in other fields such as human-computer interaction and the sociology of death. More profoundly, I discovered then that the field suffers from a barrenness when it comes to certain areas of life. It lacks a concept of tragedy, a notion of limit and endings, and has a very unripe or one-dimensional concept of vulnerability. So, as an existentialist, one may easily have issues with this barren field. Something is lacking. In the hardcore of the discipline, political communication and journalism, and within the long-term debates about public opinion, the public sphere is and should be neutral and purged of anything existential, religious. In the classic schools of media sociology, concerns about media effects or uses and gratifications, centering on relationships between media use, human behavior, sociality and well-being, were formulated from high ground, where the lonely mass is always somewhere else than the detached sociologist himself. For critical theory and political economy, there are no existential and religious dimensions in life worthy of attending to. Period. And in cultural studies, meaning, identity and culture, as well as power and resistance, are always conceived of within a taken for granted secular framework of the everyday. Later subfields have similarly not attended to the classic existentialist concerns in their own right. And in the hybrid field of media, religion and culture, while being interested in the mediated aspects of how humans relate to the transcendent and how newer media forms influence the shape that existential needs take in our modern mediatized era, this field has not primarily been influenced by existential philosophy, but motivated by other frameworks within the sociology of religion and cultural studies. Newer approaches in contemporary debates on media and communication, such as non-representational and non-media-centric media studies, have sought to broaden beyond a narrow focus on media as determinants of the social, cultural, or political developments studied. It has sought to dislodge the media from the center of attention to see, for example, codependencies with other aspects of everyday life. Yet the focus is very often on cheerfully living with our data or moving about the world equipped with media in quite harmonious ways. And this goes for some forms of media phenomenology too. It is clear this is simplified and that there are many important exceptions. The seminal work of John Durham Peters has already opened up a wealth of ideas in the direction of existential media studies. And to the textual, social and institutional forms of media studies, he has added the material, technological, civilizational form, which he ultimately in this book, The Marvelous Clouds, develops into a philosophy of elemental media, which is a kind of realist and materialist post-human position. Fire, clouds and sea are media. In a lush and liberal spirit, he develops his elemental media philosophy as a branch of metaphysics. Media are modes of being. That is, they are, quote, vessels and environments, containers of possibility that anchor our existence and make what we are doing possible, end of quote. And media are furthermore, quote, strategies and tactics of culture and society as the devices and crafts by which humans and things, animals and data hold together in time and space, end of quote. So Peters thus reorganizes media history and theory along two horizons. The first is the proposition that media are of the first ontological order, as they ground us in being. They are literally earthbound, geophysically defined and defining, and that's why they are central and of ethical and existential and ecological import. They support and sustain us. The second horizon destabilizes the first and gravitates toward recognition of problems posed by dynamic objects or unfixable processes that take a fleeting form, the cloud being the sheath material and metaphorical mobilizer of this thinking. And this actually amounts to a truly radical media theology, as he calls it, that offers a post-secular redefinition of media studies by means of turning attention to what is rather than what must mean. He thus turns to nature in all its meaningful and meaningless other than humanness as the blueprint for a kind of alien epistemology. so we can marvel at the cosmos without understanding its message and meaning. Recently, he further suggested that media studies has 3 missions. One is aesthetic and has to do with denaturalizing what seems so natural to us. One is political and has to do with critique. And the third is metaphysical, doing away with the subject-object distinction in Western philosophy, for instance. Now, existential media studies has a stake in this triadic mission, but will add something to it. Existential media, as I will argue today, are to some extent such grounded and grounding phenomena. We are stuck with them and they sustain us. But in addition, they also throw us up into the air. We are digitally thrown in a general and specific limit situations of life. Hence, beyond these actualities of media ontology that we are co-constituted by our technologies, we must also choose and act in and with the media. This evokes a different kind of subject for media studies, the coexister, to which I will return in great detail. Being thrown, according to Martin Heidegger, into the pre-given world means finding ourselves in a particular place, at a historical point in time, and among a particular group of people, and among particular technologies, I will add, in utter uncertainty and with the inevitable task to make meaning, that is, to realize ourselves. My reading further infuses the concept of thrownness with vulnerability. Existential media speak to and about vulnerability in particular ways. When defining vulnerability, one may follow in the footsteps of Judith Butler, who argues that to acknowledge and articulate vulnerability changes its meaning. Butler's version of existential vulnerability sees attachment as exposure. She argues that, quote, loss and vulnerability seem to follow from our being socially constituted bodies, attached to others, at risk of losing those attachments, exposed to others, at risk of violence by virtue of that exposure. So drawing on Levinas, Butler argues that we are bound to each other and therefore exposed. And in her work, as well as in other feminist works in ethics, vulnerability is both irreducibly ontological, that is given, shared among all of us, and yet social and unevenly distributed. But the theory lacks an understanding of mediation and technology. Philosopher of technology Mark Huckelberg, by contrast, suggests a relational anthropology of existential vulnerability, stressing the dual role of technology as shielding us from vulnerability while creating new vulnerable dependencies. He also stresses our ethical responsibility. I will move on a bit here. Being digitally thrown, then, means becoming in and with the rapidly changing technological world in displacement. This displacement is because this given and emergent connected world, with all its possibilities that we all know about and are familiar with, it also implies resurgent existential challenges and, to some extent, new ethical predicaments. So this is what I mean by the digital limit situation. So in order then to further sort of populate this radical space opened up by Jon Peters, existential media studies suggest that our life, or our media life, is precarious and inhabited by striving coexisters. The mission of media studies in this third sense also implies envisioning beings that display intersubjective responsiveness. This acting ethical subject is the coexister, who is thrown into the limit situations of life to navigate terrains of shared digital and human vulnerability. And I will now share 3 examples of this, of when this figure emerges and becomes visible. So let's now enter into the digital limit situation. Mourners that we studied, and those terminally ill bloggers, turn to the internet as a literal lifeline, providing a medium of what we have termed lifeline communication. Mourners describe the lifeline as momentous. Without the Facebook group, they would not be here today. They would have killed themselves. This involves human charitable presence through likes and hearts, simply being there, in respect also for alterity and in respect for silence. This is a haptic practice. It's mundane and material and constitutes an ongoing project, checking in, logging results, updating. Certainly, Lifeline communication is not about representation or narrative, or not at least, it's not at least simply about that. But it's also about locating and confirming each other's presence online. Lifeline communication also occurs right by the abyss, at complete loss for words quite often, and at loss for orientation. So what we have observed here is that the support is not verbose. It's often in this shape of phatic communion or through emojis. Mourners feel that a small heart is enough, you have been seen. So here is an ethics of care. Through this simplicity of just being there in shared vulnerability for one another online. In Lifeline communication, it's possible then to see, and here I'm quoting Ansaldua, cited in Susanne Bost's work, wounds as openings to become vulnerable and available present to others, end of quote. And this implies an ethics of care based on crossing boundaries between individuals and recognizing dependence and vulnerability. So here, Lifeline communication offers a potential for existential communication. Second, in a study on how some mourners chose to communicate with the dead online, it was clear that for them, the dead are online and they are getting the message. So here I'm interviewing Sarah, who lost her brother in it was a sports accident some years ago, actually 12 years ago. Can you describe in a little more detail how you know that Nicholas can hear you on the digital memorial and not by the physical grave? Sarah, it's very difficult to explain, but I think the written word becomes so definite. It remains, but spoken words disappear into nothingness, an empty void. They land nowhere. Although sometimes I think he can actually hear my thoughts, and it feels good to think that way. So it's here worth noting that the internet and social media establish one-way communication with the dead. The digital dead are like lurkers somehow. They are silent and attentive and watchful. And as opposed to other forms of techno-spirituality, such as if you think about the spiritual telegraph, there is no expectation of receiving an answer from the grave. The dead are silent receivers of our commemorations. Yet as lurkers, they are awake and attentive, like angels then. But in addition, whilst the dead remain silent receivers, they are all pervasive and they can still be connected too. And the internet is then a place of full and total connection. So I think they reflect something important about the dominant medium of our time. Okay, so the internet is then a medium of presence and always there-ness. I've also written about the digital afterlife and the so-called transcendence industry. That is those services you can buy to either delete or preserve yourself for eternity. Yes, I will show you an example of what I mean about this. But I've analyzed this I've framed this as part of a digital memory culture that one-sidedly celebrates the virtues of non-stop connectivity, limitless perpetuation, and endless recording. So it seems then that in an age of absolute presence, that seems to simultaneously gravitate to or eternalization somehow. Proper endings and erasures are far and few between. In this genre, The future of mourning is also in the hands of entrepreneurs who are working to make the dead less gone from our lives. And these visions entail legacy avatars, mind clones and grief bots, now under development. One example that is on the market now is less fantastical. It's automated farewell messaging. Let me see if I can show you an example here.
Hey, princess.
I see you. Oh my god, it's absolutely oh my god. It's one thing and
I know you've probably been dreaming about this day for pretty much your entire life, and if you want to know the truth, I have too. Elizabeth, my love, I'm so proud of you. You must be clutching your chest right now in shock. Hey, Ben. Today is a special day, and I want you to represent the family because I can't be there. I wish I could be there so badly for you, Julia. You have no idea. But I'm so proud of you. By now you've met the man of your dreams, and you're gonna ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after. Today is your day to celebrate the amazing job you've done with Julia all these years. I'm sorry I can't be there, but raise a toast in my honor. Listen, Ben, you're the man of the house now. I need you to walk your little sister, Julia, down the aisle and take care of your mother. And don't be sad for me, Julia, because I'm in a better place, and even though I'm not with you literally, I'm always with you in your heart. You'll always have Ben and your mother for support. I just want to say I love you. I want you to go out there and have a great wedding and a great rest of your life. All right? I'll see you later.
Hey Dad, Ben and me need some help. What are you doing?
Nothing. You'll see.
Come on.
Okay, so these are some examples of what I've been attending to. Finally then, there's another example I'd like to share about a study on parents who built memorials to their dead children, where I traced narratives about the risk of becoming stuck by sticky media, by technological attachments that are as factual as they are ambivalent. And this invokes the value of disconnection and what I call technoexistential closure for parents. Esbjörn lost his daughter in an accident. And when I asked him, how would you feel if Facebook would shut down? And he said, it would feel like killing her once more. If they disappeared, that means the memorials, that would not be good. Facebook does not feel okay at all. You can't escape it. You force yourself and you are forced by it. They have hijacked our lives. You need some air in your grief to push things away. It's important that it's okay to do that. If you are in an emotional state, in that mood of despair, it's easier to go astray if you have bought this Facebook thing. So for Esbjörn, the Facebook memorial means the world to him. Yet he hates Facebook, and the fact that it never sleeps and creates these types of attachments. So some parents feel the need to shut the digital lights of the departed loved ones, and this becomes an existential necessity. This company, Afterhelp, that I have been interviewing, offers such a service. But I need to move on to get to my point, or my concluding points. So, when we place the mourning human being at the center of media studies, a need for a different subject emerges. So I posit the coexister as the key subject in the dawning project of existential media studies. A vulnerable, relational, responsible, stumbling, hurting, mortal, embodied, communicative yet often silent, self-aware yet clueless, singular yet plural being, who navigates the limit situations of life in the digital age. And this is, I also see the individuals in the video we just watched as coexisters, although we can discuss what that format does. What does it do to us as mourning human beings? The coexister is something other than the savvy user, or the early adopter, or the media citizen, the entrepreneurial self, or the individual of various factions of theorization. And hence also something different than the liberal humanist subject. It's not an autonomous and certain self, to the contrary. Jaspers argues that this form of self-being is actually lacking at core. Quote, "To come to myself as I perish is the phenomenon of self-being," end of quote. Nor does the coexister coincide with the affective forces replacing the liberal subject in the new materialism. This main inhabitant of the digital ecology, in fact, pushes beyond and reinvents the human after post-humanism. So, and while existential media studies put stress on experiences of exposure, this is not a reiteration of the lonely mass or the chaotic mass of mass civilization critique. Existential media studies is not detached science, so it will stubbornly break it to you. We are all coexisters. And since vulnerability is, as Carl Jaspers argue, a position of fecundity, a productivity, the exister is not simply a prey to the forces of modernity, at least not reducible to such a prey. So existential media studies inaugurates a dialogue between existential philosophy and media studies. It places media communication and digital mediation at the center of the understanding of the contemporary human condition. It simultaneously offers a timely re-articulation of the media and the digital beyond those widely established social, political, economic and cultural frameworks of interpretation. Emphasizing through an analytical focus on, for example, the limit situation, how digital and human vulnerabilities intersect. So, as I argue in my book, existential media are both grounding and escapable objects that require a multifocality of vision, a complexity of language, and an embrace of both limits and irreducibility. We might also, of course, note that media have always been existential if we look to history and media history. And we could also, in line with Don Eide in his work Technis and Praxis, affirm that human-machine relations are existential relations in which our fate and destiny are implicated, but which are subject to the very ambiguity found in all existential relations. Hence, I think that the existential approach actually takes us a bit further than simply saying that media are existential in a sort of representational sense or in ritual sense. They have to do with our understanding of being human. This question about choice and ethical choice is vital in an age where the very horizon of the future seems to be colonized by the prospects and promises of AI and autonomous systems. And in my new project, BioMe, I aim to take existential media studies in new directions. And artificial intelligence, as you know, is mapping itself onto every conceivable realm of human life and experience. it evokes both hopes and fears. But AI is, however, not only a concern for the future, and this is the starting point of the project. It's already here at our fingertips. So our lives are increasingly on automatic, so to speak. AI is part of our most intimate lives, quantified self-imaginings, embodied perceptions, our emergent practices of care and of law enforcement. Through daily use of information gathering services, we leave behind intimate details about our lives, including biometric and health-related data, such as fingerprints, heart rates, and facial scans. Smart household appliances such as Amazon Alexa do more than passively follow their users' voice commands. Through new forms of domestic surveillance, corporations record our words and interpret our sounds, often for unspecified reasons or purposes. The sum of our personal data is further increasingly treated as assets for authentication and verification of our true selves. And police and judiciary systems are developing both face and voice recognition in preemptive policing. So these automated technologies provoke immediate questions then about privacy and privacy infringement, ethics, security. The European Commission has recently stated that, quote, technology should also be ethical and secure. For this reason, the Commission is proposing an approach that places people at the center of the development of AI. That is human-centric AI, end of quote. The call for human-centric AI must also be, as we argue in this project, in effect, a call for a state-of-the-art humanistic approach to autonomous technologies. So the purpose then of our research project is to investigate existential possibilities and challenges, as well as ethical risks and imperatives, as our embodied existence and everyday life world become ever more entangled with biometrics. And I will show you and also draw your attention to this space here, which is a hub that I set up this summer at Uppsala University, the Uppsala Informatics and Media Hub for Digital Existence. This is a home for existential media studies. It is a place where people with similar interests working in the human sciences, interested in existential issues relating to automation, are now gathering. And I will show you, the project is here, and you can follow our project here. And here you can see who is on board. Your local hero, Jacek, is also part of the project. So, yes. My own study then will be about the biometric person emerging through the passport in the EU and different practices of self-quantification. Matilda Tudor, you might know Matilda, she will study the transparency ideology and how face recognition affects exposed groups such as the LGBTQ plus groups and migrants who don't want to be recognized. She will look at face recognition. Jacek will study living with and against voice capture, and also looking at smart home devices, but also through, as usual, an artistic lens of how voice capture can be also intervened in through artistic practices. And then Jenny Eriksson Lundström, who is a scholar in information systems and who wrote her dissertation on AI. She will study datafied preemptive policing and juridical decision-making. Charles S., who is our ethics advisor, will also be involved in our work with stakeholders and society. And of course, we're not the first to be doing anything in this field of biometrics or the quantified self. It's actually a rather crowded field, isn't it? There's a lot of work going on there. See now. And the work on biometrics of the quantified self is now roughly divided into two main emphasis, the phenomenological emphasis focusing on lived experience and of data, and the biopolitical focusing on neoliberal subjectivity, data mining and power. Excuse me. So our project will also scrutinize this aspect of linking bodies to identities, and we argue that at stake here is more than mundane experience, privacy or commodification. Again, this will be an exercise in existential media studies, combining it with approaches from critical data studies, media phenomenology, and other approaches. So we will focus on critical concerns of a larger existential nature, specifically the foundational aspects of what makes a person distinct, distinguishes her individuality, and, as some argue, her inviolable value, as you can see here. The human face, the human voice, and the human body. Now this is starting out next year, after Christmas. And I don't have time, right, Bosse, to go into the methods and methodology, but as you can see, this is also an exercise in integrative and generative human science. What does that mean? Well, we intend to provide perspective, but also to be part of not building AI, but actually engaging with those who do. So as you can see, we are partnering with CHAIR, Chalmers Artificial Intelligence Research Center. And I'm also in the process of starting up something I call the Human Observatory for Digital Existence at the Sigtuna Foundation. I've worked with them before. And this is another word for samverkan, right? Okay, the Human Observatory. Sounds better. Okay, but you can ask me afterwards about this. Let's go back and let's conclude. The machines are ever present, and they are mediating the universal limit situations, constituting new ones that we are obliged to attend to. I want to die is an utterance in despair and an invitation to existential communication. The text message shows up and can't be ignored. The frail channel is open and is irrevocably there. Hearts are beating at two ends. What to do? Stressing that media are things in the middle, John Peters argues that this is their very nature. They, quote, show up wherever we humans face the unmanageable mortality of our material existence, the melancholy facts that memory cannot hold up, body cannot last, that time is at base the merciless and generous habitat for humans and things. Media in the middle may shield and soothe, but they may aggravate and augment. Both prospects are in the balance. And here coexisters are invited, perhaps to acknowledge that what the situation may require is, instead of communication, to use the media at hand to try and give a sign of compassionate connective presence. I'm here. I'm staying. The SMS is existential and thus momentous media, because the lifeline it provides is co-constituted by our will to offer something simple yet sustaining, often beyond mere words, to offer to share in someone's despair. In fact, as I hope to have demonstrated here, existential media studies also offers up something worthwhile for the ontological stakes of elemental media philosophy, retaining with Jaspers the idea that we have a role to play. Since, quote, the world attracts existence as the medium of its realization, end of quote. Existential philosophy reminds us that we are assigned a particular task in this concrete world, becoming ourselves, projecting ourselves, and projecting a world of communality and dignity. Existential media studies thus acknowledges that the classic existential questions about human responsibility, the role of limits and finitude, have not been done away with or resolved. They are instead acutely reactivated in digital existence. And even if the machine solves a certain problem, or even humanity's many problems, I maintain that it's not the computer that is called to act, to respond, to realize herself. And it is humans who can and must take ethical responsibility for each other. Now we can hear the objections, right? Could not AI in fact provide us with certain secure and accurate formulas for responding to someone in despair, supported by big data evidence? Maybe, absolutely. But would this not allow for ridding ourselves of responsibility for the situation? How would we feel? We can discuss this. How would we feel if we reached out in utmost anxiety to a friend, but could never be sure if it was in fact software that responded? And in addition, if we wish to outsource moral decision-making to machines or allow algorithms to teach us about ethics, we need ourselves to be talking about and doing ethics in the first place. So the ethical responsibility pertains to how we endorse or denounce the machines that we are building. Existential media studies is a retooled form of humanism and therefore a call for protecting the imperiled practice of humanistic practice. It provides for a language that retains rich nuances, not only leaves space for, but privileges, limits, failure, interruption, paradox, openness, silence, indeterminacy, ambivalence, imagination, uncertainty, contingency, deep relationality and dependency. And this is a language keenly needed in our time of data truths and aspirations to perfection, as machines are imagined to know more about us than we do ourselves. But all media, even AI, have limits. Therefore, we need an acting coexister who remolds existence in humble self-realization and in care for the world. I think I will stop there, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you.